This is the Amazing Education Podcast. Powered by the Ames Community School District, I'm your host, Eric Smith. On today's episode, we are joined by Ames Superintendent Dr. Paula Vincent. It's school budget season, and we're going to have an amazing conversation about the process and considerations that are needed to set the fiscal budget for next school year. Dr. Paula Vincent, welcome to this episode of the Amazing Education Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
So a couple months ago, when we did your first podcast episode, I wasn't so sure that we would have an opportunity for a second one, and yet here we are.
How about that?
I do always reflect on the school calendar and cycle. Everything kind of moves in cycles, and for this episode, we're getting into budget season.
Very definitely, yes.
As is every district across the state. I mean, This is the time of year that although we are only halfway through this school year, we have to have that lens and eye on what the next year looks like.
That's correct. We're planning right now for fiscal 23, even though we aren't quite even into the 2022 calendar year, but that's the way school finance works in Iowa.
I'm going to fully admit, this isn't the flashy of topics. It's not the flashiest of things to talk about, but it's incredibly important. I mean, not only for our district, but we're going to take an approach on this particular podcast to speak somewhat broadly about, funding in public education, but then, also look somewhat specifically in Ames on some of the things that we're looking at. And then most of the episode, we're going to talk about the process that it takes to work a budget. It's a multi-month process.
Yes. And actually there are key dates that happen all year round, but we are approaching the critical time for that planning to start to draw some conclusions.
So I do joke with people, I've learned a lot from our CFO. Having gone through the bond referendum several years ago, her and we had to have many of conversations. And, I joked with her at the time, and I would continue to now. I would ask her what I thought was a very simple question. And of course, she has, that wide range of knowledge around school finance. And she gave me a very long answer. And I was like, okay, but what does that really mean? So I'm going to now put that pressure on you and try to give us a broad sense about how school budgets are determined in public education.
Yes, and just very quickly, if anyone has specific questions or wants to go into detail, we are fortunate to have one of the most talented CFOs in the state, and would just say to folks they should reach out to us and have that conversation. But in Iowa, our funding for public schools is based on what's known as a foundation plan, and it's unique. There aren't very many states that have that particular approach, but it basically is a pupil-driven plan. So enrollment is a critical first step, and we do have that first step in our planning process. That's that snapshot of students that are members of our district on a certain date every year. We call that the certified enrollment, along with some weighting that goes for special populations. But we have that piece. And based on that piece, the state establishes what they call their allowable funding per pupil. And it's a little over $7,000 in Iowa right now. So the certified enrollment times that state cost really sets the parameter for what we are able to spend. And we get very concerned about our authority. So that's a key word in Iowa, our authority to spend. And the reason for that is trying to make sure all students across the state have access to a similar type education. You would have property-rich districts like Ames that have the capacity to spend more than some other districts in the state, but they want to try to have that control within Iowa for the basis of equity. So we come up against sometimes being able to have cash in the bank, so to speak, but we don't have the permission to spend it. So that authority, cash authority in Iowa is also critical. It's also partly a measure that helps us try to be prudent with our tax rates, and that those taxing rates are also similar across Iowa. So it doesn't depend as much on where you live in terms of what your property tax might turn out to be.
So I found that, in addition to all of the things that you said, I want to briefly give you an opportunity to also talk about, we talk about like there's different silos of money, and the
Yes,
general fund
yes.
is one of the biggest ones for budget purposes that, we are looking at, because that's the one that pays staff salaries, the benefits. And so like that's one that, we really have to pay close attention to. Not to make this about school finance podcast, but there are other pockets of money that we do look at. And one of the things, and I haven't heard it recently, but I understand the sentiment is, well, we're building this really big high school right now, yet, we could be talking about a number of staffing considerations. Well, they don't really relate to each other in some ways.
Yeah.
So I want to give you an opportunity to explain that a bit.
It is, and it is maybe one of the more complex strategies for everyone to understand. But our funding very definitely comes in separate pots. And the general fund, as you mentioned, it's by and far our largest amount of money and the place where we have the most flexibility. We still have specific guidelines about what is an allowable expenditure and what's not in every category. But we do have categories of funding to try to allow for things like construction. Those would be mostly coming out of a physical plant fund, or in this case, the community passed a bond referendum, so there is bond capacity there. We have funds that are specific for maintaining the buildings. Again, that goes back to the physical plant and equipment levy. We have a small fund for instructional support to allow for some of the curriculum adoptions.
Yeah.
But every category has very tight specific strings, if you will, about what it can be used for. And we can't intermingle those funds in most circumstances. So when we're talking about our staffing or our teachers and our support staff, those by and large are general fund expenditures.
So you talked about enrollment a bit ago. Ames experienced this last year, and as did many other districts, but we saw a slight dip in enrollment last year. And so we saw a rebound this year, but what we see on October 1, and we saw more students, in our district on October 1 this year, yes, that impacts our next year, but we also think about last year and how that impacted us. So talk us through a little bit
Yes.
about our current situation in Ames on how we essentially borrowed from ourselves, for this year.
Yeah. Iowa really does try to help districts keep as even a keel as they can for their expenditures. And so, again, it's a function of that authority of what we can spend. When you are pupil-driven like we are in Iowa and you have that significant drop in student enrollment, you don't have those students to drive your basic general fund.
Mm-hmm.
So Iowa has a provision that allows us to go on what's known as a budget guarantee, which means that we don't have to reduce our expenditures by that full amount at one time. If that enrollment never rebounds, you have to keep reducing to that. But as you mentioned, we essentially got authority to spend the difference between what that prior year's enrollment was and the year in which we had the drop. So we kind of borrowed about $300,000. That's good for that year that we're in.
Yes.
It's hard for next year in that we have, I'm using the word pinch point, of we've got to repay that amount. Good news, our enrollment bounded back up, but it didn't bound back up enough to have new growth in our budget, and we all know costs are going up for everything. So we've got to, before we can even think about any increased costs for maintenance or cost of food or any of those, even though they're across multiple areas, we've got to repay that $300,000. So it does kind of put us upside down, if you will, for our planning for this next school year, which is fiscal 23.
So how do we lead this process? And I say we, but as superintendent, this is one of the big bullets in your job description.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is a critical part of a process that you ultimately lead. And so I'll ask like the simple question. On budgets like this in schools, don't we just take whatever we did last year and apply it to this year, and everything works out great?
I'm sure different people have different strategies, and there are some rolling costs that you're going to have to be able to clean your buildings. You're going to have instructional supplies for students, all those things. And of course, our biggest expenditure by far are our staff. Typically, that's between 80 to 83% of your budget is in people. To help with that, I like to look at some models of school finance that have been researched over time. One that I'm familiar with and rely on actually comes out of the University of Wisconsin.
Okay.
And it's about a 20-year look. It's a professor, I think, emeritus now, Mr. Auden, Dr. Auden, really spent his lifetime looking and researching school finance. But it encourages you to think about what data do you have that allows the process to be more based on a data look than any arbitrary sort of decision making, trying to shed a light on it. So, for example, right now we are looking at what are the class sizes we might desire, what's our current state, and how close are we to that standard that we want to set. And there are standards for every single category of school finance. So it's a combination of understanding where we are, looking at what we think is ideal, and matching that up with what are the available resources. And that's where we are in the process right now.
And it's a starting point. For us as a
Totally.
district, and I would imagine for other districts, looking at that research and that work, it's a good grounding exercise to start the process of considerations on decisions that ultimately need to be made.
Well, there's that framework or that kind of model that you look at, but then you have to also look at, and so how are the children doing?
Yeah.
So there's all the factors of high needs, special needs, and we certainly want to be conscious of any data we have in our student achievement databases about, is there a place where we might feel like we need extra support based on how that performance is looking on like mathematics and literacy sorts of measures.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to use triangular sets of data as a basis that we can both be transparent about and that we have a good hypothesis of will actually make a difference for student learning, which of course is our ultimate goal.
Well, I part of the intent of this podcast episode is to sort of open that door a little bit because there is a lot of thought and considerations that need to take place when establishing the budget for the next year. So, just in the last week, that process continued, chart paper on the walls with our different school buildings. It had some student data on there because you need to be able to visually see those things in order to be informed on, all right, what does our district look like? How does this elementary look, compared to this elementary? What supports do they have? And it's all part of that process.
And it's helpful sometimes for me to think about that in terms of layers. So your primary layer goes through about if everything was the same and you had Lake Wobegon, all the kids who were above average, here's what we think it would take to move instruction. But then as you lift a layer and you look at, but wait, all of our kids aren't necessarily above average or the circumstances aren't the same. So how can we very intentionally apply another layer of resources? But you want everyone to understand what went into that and the data that you're using to make those decisions. So at the end of the day, you have a logical model that has a hypothesis based in research that also applies the resources you have, but that people can understand so that you don't create a scenario where people might feel like one situation gets more treatment or disparate treatment versus another.
Yeah. And all of this, just to reiterate something that you said before, all of this is with a cap on our spending authority.
Right.
So there isn't an infinite pot of money that can be spent. Another term that I want you to define, because I've heard, us talk about it, is categorical funds. So what are those, and how do
Yeah.
they weigh into this process?
One big one would be our funding for students that happen to have disabilities. Our special ed fund would be categorical, and again, they're very specific to the needs of individual children, but those funds cannot be used for a non-special education purpose. So they have to be spent to help support the students that have been identified as in need of those services. Similarly, we have a categorical fund for students that happen to be learning English as a language. And it's time limited and it's amount limited.
Yeah.
I could go through, they aren't huge amounts, but we have several small amounts. We have one around professional development for teachers.
Yeah.
That's another categorical. So categorical just means it's a specific cause and has specific parameters we must adhere to. And again, general fund is that's kind of like our family checking accounts.
Yeah.
And then our saving accounts might be for these other special purposes that we've
Yeah.
set aside funds for.
But the intent with these categorical funds, obviously you said they're very specific, but the intent is to use them with a shared vision for the district so that they can
Correct.
complement how the general fund is being used.
That's right. And most of them, not all, but most of them have very strict guidelines too. They can't supplant. You have to use your basic funding, which is that funding which is controlled
Yeah.
first, and then you can bring in these other resources.
Okay.
But you can't replace one for the other.
So this is going to, progress over the next several months. There's going to be more information that comes to us, more considerations. How much does this time of year, ultimately weigh on you as a leader? We are, in some ways, there is a need to take a system approach and a system lens to these decisions, and yet at the same time, we're talking about, kids, families,
Yeah.
it's a lot.
This is always an interesting time of year in the school business because we're in the thick of the current school calendar, and yet it is also, we must be very attentive to that long-range planning for the next school year. And that really does kick up right about now,
Yeah.
and heavily between now and March. You really have to be pulling together your substantial planning for the next year,
Yeah.
both around budget. And of course, budget drives staffing, and we want to be able to be as proactive as possible with any recruitment that's necessary
Yeah.
this year. You want to be thinking about what will those contracts look like? I mean, how do we retain the quality employees that we do have? So it is an interesting overlap, and you're hopefully, as you said, always working on that with that question in the back of your mind about how do we think this impacts our ability to reach our ultimate purpose?
Well, and one of the interesting things in that, we talked about, or I referenced more information coming. That's why starting this process by looking at our student data, I've just found really refreshing for us to do, because that is work that we can do now. One
correct.
piece of information that we don't necessarily have yet is we know in a system our size, we're going to have some teachers that are going to retire at the end of the year.
Right.
But we don't know entirely who those teachers are.
Right.
Or there may be some, teachers or staff who, they have to move, and, they may go to another district, and so they
Right.
won't be with our district next year. That's all part of the process. But that is information that, it is December. We don't have that information yet, and so that'll be another layer that comes in.
And as we move forward through the winter and spring, we need to be able to make educated guesses about our staffing needs and hire as many as we think we need and are likely, with the understanding that a few of those final details will come. It's fascinating when you've been at it a little while. I have yet to be in a school district in August prior to the start of a school year and not ended up with just a handful of positions to hire.
Yeah.
In spite of your best efforts.
Yep.
But the goal is to have as few of those as possible because your pool of candidates, of course, is much wider. It's like a funnel in the spring. The most critical piece that we don't know yet, and of course, isn't within our control. Obviously, we try to influence, but what will the legislature do in terms of funding for schools this year? And, they have their own big picture of
Yep.
trying to manage state finance. And yet in Iowa with the foundation plan, they set that cost per pupil.
Yeah.
And so until we have that last critical piece,
Right.
We're planning a little bit without all the information. But, history would allow us to have some educated guesses.
Yeah. And we've done that. I mean, we're
Right.
anticipating, a certain amount, but we don't know. That
Right.
could change.
We don't absolutely know, but we know probably some broad parameters.
Yeah, sure. So ultimately, what can our staff, what can our community expect as far as, where does this process take us? We talked about some of the more recent and early work related to budget. A lot of these conversations also happen at our school board table. They get
Right.
run through the committee, school board committee.
Correct.
And then ultimately get talked about at our board table. Anything else to add related to that?
Just that, again, we want to complete this process timely enough that we can hit a very proactive window for hiring and recruitment. Likely, we won't have all of the pieces together at a time that, there are some state timelines we have to meet.
Yeah.
But as we inform the board, we'll have what appears to be a likely scenario, and we probably will want to have a range depending on that last piece of state funding that we don't really know when we'll get that piece.
Yeah. The work starts early and it lasts
Yeah.
several months.
It's a good 2 to 2.5 month process.
Yeah.
And we want to just do it in such a way that we know we've started with the student data, that ultimate goal in mind, that we've done it in a way that others can see the logic behind it. And particularly if you have to end up making tough decisions, that there is a rationale and criteria for that anyone can understand and follow.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Vincent, I wanted to thank you for being on this episode of the Amazing Education Podcast. This is something that, oftentimes doesn't always get articulated, all that well. And I thought maybe this podcast would be the best way to share that process because there is a lot that goes into it.
Well, I really thank you for the opportunity, and would just close by saying there are a lot of moving parts and pieces, and if anybody hears this and wants to go deeper or have a little bit more understanding, I hope they will reach out to you or to me and would be happy to go into more detail.
Absolutely. I absolutely love that. Well, thank you again.
All right. Thank you.